After this evening's lecture, as is always our practice, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions of Mr. McKibben. There is one microphone stand will be here on the lower level and one on the second level. And we'd ask that you please use the microphone so that all can hear, and keep your questions short, if you will, and limited to one so that we can accommodate as many of you as possible during the limited time that we have available. Following the closing remarks this evening, Mr. McKibben will be signing copies of his books in the lobby. Follett's, our campus bookstore, will also have copies of his books available for sale. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce William DeMott, Professor of Biology, who will be introducing our guest speaker this evening. Dr. DeMott has been a member of the biology faculty at IPFW since 1986. His research on lake food chains has been supported by grants from the National Science Foundation and by fellowships from the Max Planck Society of Germany and the Royal Dutch Academy of Sciences. Dr. DeMott is the author of 49 peer-reviewed scientific articles and has served as a reviewer of over 1,200 manuscripts for more than 50 scientific journals. In 2011, Dr. DeMott received the Outstanding Researcher Award. He teaches general biology, intermediate ecology, aquatic biology, and population ecology. Please welcome Dr. William DeMott.
About 2 months ago, I was very excited to learn that Bill McKibben would be presenting one of our Omnibus lectures. I want to start by thanking the people who invited Bill and those who have provided financial and organizational support for his visit to our campus. Bill McKibben has many achievements that we value very highly at our university. Bill is an outstanding writer, educator, scholar, athlete, grassroots organizer, and environmental activist. Bill has written articles for many periodicals and is the author or editor of 15 books, according to my count. The first of Bill's award-winning books on climate change was published a really long time ago, back when I was a new professor at this university and when Bill and I were both young men. Bill is a distinguished scholar at Middlebury College in Vermont. Scholars are often criticized for being isolated from the real world. In contrast, Bill does not just write about the climate problem, he has made the fight for strong action his life's work. Bill McKibben and his Middlebury students founded a grassroots organization with notable and easy to remember name. That's 350.org or 350.org. What began as a student group has organized over 20,000 climate rallies in 188 countries. My questions for Bill are not about the science. I spent a lot of time keeping up to date on the latest scientific evidence. My question for Bill is this: what can I do to fight for strong action on climate in our community, in our state, and in our nation? Now it's my pleasure to welcome Bill McKibben to the stage and to our Northeast Indiana community.
Well, Chancellor Carwine and Professor DeMott, thank you so much for those kind introductions. What a pleasure to be with you all here today. Perhaps more my pleasure than yours. I'm reminded always when I come to some place, beautiful campus like this, on a beautiful day like this, maybe a little warmer than it should be, but a gorgeous day. You know, I'm reminded that my essential role in the world is just to bum people out, you know? And I apologize in advance for that, and I will try to get through the depressing, hard stuff quickly and on to slightly more hopeful things. But there is no use talking about any of this without some sense of the scale and the pace of the problem that we face, because that determines the scale and the pace of the solutions that we require. And this, I fear, is the biggest, fastest moving problem of its kind, crisis of its kind that human beings have yet come up against. We haven't known about it all that long. As Professor DeMott said, I wrote the first book about this, and it came out only 26 years ago. But it is broken over our heads with astonishing force. All 10 of the hottest years we've ever recorded have come in the last 15 years. 2014 was the hottest year for which humans have records, but 2015 is going to smash that record by a large margin. We knew 25 years ago that we were in trouble because we understood that the molecular structure of CO2 trapped heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. About that, there was no real doubt. But scientists, being conservative as scientists usually are, had the hope that it would take a while for this to fully manifest. Had you told the scientific community a quarter century ago that we would already have seen the loss of half or more of the summer sea ice in the Arctic, they would have said, no, that'll take a century. Had you said we would already be at the point where enough melt had occurred underneath the great ice sheets of the Antarctic that they've apparently begun a kind of irreversible slide into the ocean, they would have said, no, those ice sheets should be stable on a century time scale. Had you said to them, the oceans will be 30% more acidic in a quarter century because the chemistry of seawater will change as it absorbs carbon from the atmosphere, they would just have looked at you, because it was bothering then to even study the pH of the oceans. The oceans seemed too big for us to fundamentally affect. But we fundamentally affect everything. And as we change the temperature of the Earth, we're beginning to see, just as all the modeling predicted, a baffling array of strange and extreme events. If for some reason you don't trust scientists about this, take the part of our business community that we ask to analyze risk for us, the insurance industry. The biggest insurer in the world, Munich Re, said a couple of years ago that there was no plausible way to explain the huge increase in disasters that they were seeing around the world, save for the extra energy that we were generating through climate change. In fact, yesterday, there was a new series of documents from some of the biggest insurance companies in the world warning that on current trends, much of the world will be, as they put it, uninsurable within a few decades. The extreme events we're seeing are just getting too strange. What do I mean? 2 weeks ago, a tropical storm on the coast of Mexico, within 24 hours, blew up into a Category 5 hurricane. It had the strongest wind speeds we've ever measured in this hemisphere and the lowest barometric pressure. Last week, in the Arabian Sea, a place where cyclones do not normally form, we had an enormous one, a Category 4 or 5 hurricane, the first one ever to make landfall on the coast of Yemen. And when it did, it brought 4 and 5 years' worth of rain in a single afternoon, with the predictable results of flood. Something like this happens now almost every day someplace on the planet, this scourge of extreme weather. And here's the daunting part about it. That's what happens early in this climate story. So far, we've raised the temperature of the Earth about 1 degree centigrade, about 1.6 or 7 degrees Fahrenheit. That's been enough to cause the kind of chaos we're already seeing. We're on a path at the moment to raise the temperature of the Earth 4 or 5 degrees centigrade before the people in college now are through with their time on this planet. And if we do that, then the disruption will be at a level where it is unlikely that we can have civilizations of the kind we're used to having. Some of you may remember the summer of 2012 in this part of the world, which was extremely hot and extremely dry. And as a result, probably a quadrillion kernels of corn failed to fertilize in fields across the Midwest. It was simply too hot. The agronomists at Stanford and the University of Washington, I was telling students earlier, published a study not long ago demonstrating that from this point on, each degree increase in global average temperature should be enough to cut grain yields about 10%. So if the temperature goes up 2 or 3 degrees, then the number of calories on the planet goes down 20 or 30%. Think about that. Think about what you know about the world, about instability and war and peace and development and all those other things, and you can get some sense of what that world will be like. We cannot let it happen. It is by far the biggest thing human beings have ever done. And we have to figure out how to slow it down and slow it down quickly. That's the really tough part of this. Okay, I'm through the worst you can breathe. I will breathe. And then I'll give you a piece of good news. The good news is we know more or less what we need to do, which is very quickly replace coal and gas and oil with something that doesn't pour carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And we know what that something is. It's renewable energy in all its forms. 25 years ago when we talked about this, we still did it with our fingers crossed because it was not yet ready for prime time, you know. Solar power was something that a few aging hippies, you know, down in the basement with their lead-acid batteries, you know, they were great pioneers. And thanks to them and to the engineers who followed in their wake, we now are ready. The price of a solar panel has fallen 80% in the last 6 years because the engineers have gotten so good at what they're doing. They get better all the time. The way to think of solar power or wind power is not like coal and gas and oil, which are finite resources that run out. The way to think of them is as technologies like your cell phone, which gets cheaper and cheaper and more powerful with each passing year because we get better at it. That's where the future lies. So if the bad news is the fix that we're in, and the good news is that we know what to do about it, that we can look at countries that have tried, like Germany, where they generate some days in the summer 80% of their power from solar panels, and some days in the winter 50, 60% of their power from the wind. If that's the good news, the baffling news is, why have we done essentially nothing in our country and in much of the world to tackle this problem? Why have we had a 20-year bipartisan effort on Capitol Hill to accomplish nothing? Entirely successful effort, it must be said. That's the question that at a certain point began to rankle me. I should tell you that I'm not really, though I'll show you some pictures of activism, and that's how I seem to spend all my time now. I'm not an activist at heart. I'm a writer. And so I figured, like a writer, like a professor, like a scholar, that we must be engaged in an argument here, and that if I supplied some more data and wrote some more books, that eventually we would win the argument, and on we go. Change would come. I don't want to disillusion any of the professors in the room, but it turns out that's not entirely how change does happen. At a certain point, it became clear to me that we had long since won the argument. The world's scientists were in complete agreement about what was going on, and the world's economists knew what we needed to do, put some kind of price on carbon that reflected the damage it was doing in the atmosphere so markets could go to work. We'd won the argument. We were just losing the fight, because the fight wasn't about data and argument or anything. The fight, as fights usually are, was about power and money. And there was a force in our society, in many societies, that had enough power and money to keep change from happening. And that force was the fossil fuel industry, the richest industry human beings have ever known. And they were using that power and continue to use that power to prevent change from happening. If this strikes you as hyperbolic, just 2 data points. One, as we were saying at dinner, the richest man in America is the 2 Koch brothers taken together. They've made their money in oil and gas, and they've announced that they will spend $900 million of that money in the next election. $900 million is more than the Republicans or the Democrats spent in the last election. They will do it to make sure that change doesn't come. Second data point, 3 hours ago, the Attorney General for the state of New York subpoenaed a huge trove of documents from ExxonMobil, our biggest oil company. And they said that the evidence was clear enough to start this unprecedented probe, that Exxon had both known everything there was to know about climate 25 years ago, and then systematically deceived and confused Americans and people around the world, helped sponsor and stage this pretend, faux, phony debate that's kept us from acting for the last quarter century. So, some years ago, when that began to dawn even on my kind of slow brain, I figured that I better figure out how to do more than write another book, that another book was probably not going to move the needle here. And so that's when we started this thing, 350.org. It obviously has a weird name. The number is probably the most important number in the world. It's the amount of carbon that scientists say we could safely have in the atmosphere, 350 parts per million. We're already way north of that. We crossed 400 parts per million this spring, and we're going up 2 parts per million per year. That's why the Arctic is melting. That's why California is in the deepest drought that's ever been recorded. That's why we're going to lose more land to wildfire this year than any year in our nation's history, on and on and on. So the number is important, but we chose it in part for a different reason. We chose it because we wanted to organize globally. And we figured, naively, that our greatest obstacle would be simply the fact that people around the world insisted on speaking different languages. And so it might be a good idea to have Arabic numerals instead, because they would trip lightly across those linguistic boundaries, you know. We set to work. When I say we, I mean myself and 7 undergraduates at Middlebury College, where I teach. It's just a college in rural Vermont. It's a college like this one, same kind of students, same kind of debt load, same kind of whatever, you know. We had no idea what we were doing. We had no money. We had no mailing lists. We just thought we should get to work. And so, since there were 7 students, and there are 7 continents, each one took one. The guy who took the Antarctic also had to take the internet, okay? And we set to work, and our work was to find people like ourselves in different parts of the world. And not everywhere is there something called an environmentalist, but everywhere there's someone who's worried about public health, about hunger, about war and peace, about development, about the things you cannot have on a world that's disintegrating, and those were our allies. And we asked them, the first thing we said was, we should just do a day around the world where we try and take this number and kind of drive it into the information bloodstream of the planet, at least make everybody realize what's happening. And So we asked everybody to just sort of take a day. We had no idea how well this would work. No one had ever tried anything like it, and we didn't, as I say, have any real organization. But there were a lot of people who were ready to go to work, who had seen the effects of climate change, were scared, determined. We got the first sense it might really work 2 days early. We'd asked people to do this on a Saturday. But on a Thursday, we were sitting around our office doing last-minute things. We had one room and one table for the 8 of us. We were all around it on our laptops, and the phone rings, and it's our leader in Ethiopia, who, like many of our leaders, was a she. Like all of them was a volunteer, and like a surprising number was 17 years old. And she was in tears, and she said the government took away our permit for Saturday, so we're doing our big march today before they can stop us. That was brave, because Ethiopia is not a particularly nice government, but that wasn't why she was crying. She just kept saying, we wanted to do this the same time as everybody else. We wanted to be part of the whole thing. We're so sorry. We hope we're not spoiling it for anybody. We really apologize, and we have 15,000 young people out in the street in Addis Ababa right now. So I was like, wow, don't worry about the date. It's okay. And that was the beginning of an enormously interesting weekend. Before it was out, there had been 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN called it the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history. The second picture actually came from US troops in Afghanistan, who made a 350 with sandbags and said, we're parking our Humvee for the weekend and walking, okay? But most of the pictures were coming from just all over the planet. One of the things I'd always heard in my life was environmentalism is for rich white people. If you don't know where your next meal is coming from, you won't be an environmentalist, on and on and on. It just turned out to be nonsense. It was immediately clear as these pictures flooded in, sometimes 30, 40 a minute, that most of the people we were working with around the world were poor, black, brown, Asian, and young, because that's what most of the world consists of. And what do you know? They were exactly as interested in the future as anybody else, maybe more so, because the future bears down hard on you. And there was lots of creativity and lots of wit displayed around the world, and lots and lots of, for the first time, lots of involvement by religious communities. You know, after the Pope's remarkable encyclical this summer, we're sort of used to the idea that religious leaders might, but this was the first time that that had happened. So for instance, there's South Africa, there's the leader of Muslim South Africa, the leader of kind of indigenous traditions, behind them the Anglican Archbishop at the head of a huge multi-faith march. There's our, most important evangelical liberal arts college in the country where Billy Graham went to school. I'd been to the Holy Land to do some organizing. Hard to get around because of all the military checkpoints and things, but the Dead Sea is dropping rapidly, and everybody wanted to help. There were too many barriers. We convened a meeting in Bethlehem, but it was too hard for everybody to get there. So the Jordanians said, we'll make the big 3 on our beach. The Palestinians said, we'll do the 5 in Palestine. The Israelis said, we'll take care of the 0 on our shore. It was a beautiful sight. There were 200 big demonstrations across China, which is a hard place to do this. And one of them did get broken up by the police and people arrested, but most of them went off without a hitch. And that's important because China obviously has a big role to play. China's made some very bad decisions, and they're burning a ton of coal. On the other hand, they're now cutting back sharply on coal use, and they've become the biggest developer of renewable energy around the world. Those are our colleagues. That's the Student Government Association of the Maldive Islands. Let me tell you about the Maldives, because they're the closest thing to paradise I've ever been to. White sand beaches, coconut palms. It's about 1,200 islands spread out in an archipelago that stretches 1,000 miles across the equator in the Indian Ocean. Just sublime. The only problem is the highest point in the whole archipelago is 1.5 meters, 2 meters above sea level, which is a bad place to be on a rapidly warming planet. This is a 5,000-year-old culture. the chances of it becoming 5,100 years old are slim. But they are fighting in everything they've got, and that's the Student Government Association holding their meeting in the lagoon to try and demonstrate their problem, okay? This was the biggest story on Google News for about 36 hours, and I think the reason is that editors were surprised at what environmentalists looked like. You know, they didn't look like they thought they would. Every woman in that zero over there in Yemen is in full black burqa. So to us, they don't look like members of the Sierra Club or something, but their hearts are in exactly the same place. They're not thinking about themselves, they're thinking about the future, about others, about the larger world. Even oil men, you know, that's Abu Dhabi, oil-rich sheikhdom. You can see some oil-rich sheikhs down front in their dishdashes, but these oil men are smart enough to know what's coming. If you look behind them, you'll see the edge of the largest solar array on our planet, okay? These guys are thinking they might want to stay rich no matter what, is my sense. There were 300 or 400 pictures from that day that ended up in a file marked 350 adorable, okay? And they were adorable, and they were also hard to look at. I mean, those girls are going to be refugees probably in their lifetime, and not from anything they did, from stuff we did, you know? So we've kept on doing these kind of things all over the world. The estimate is that we've sponsored about 20,000 demonstrations, and in every country except North Korea, and they've been beautiful and educational and informative, and brought this message to all kinds of places that might not ever have gotten it otherwise, and some of them very tough and difficult places, and some of them places I'd never heard of before, or places that I'd heard of but for other reasons, you know. And I frankly love this kind of work and loved all the aspects. We were doing these giant art projects, so big that they had to be viewed from outer space. There's 3,000 people. Those of you with a good classical education may remember King Canute, who tried to hold back the rising seas. There's the image of King Canute on the beach at Brighton. There's people leaving the roof of a house in the Dominican Republic, an image that's become all too common now in our world of flood. That scarab beetle is pushing solar panels across the Egyptian desert. This was my favorite of all those pictures. That's one of those dry riverbeds in the Southwest now where this great drought has settled in. But when the satellite came over, several thousand people flipped those blue blankets up over their heads just to bring the river back to life for a second, you know. I would like nothing more than just to keep doing this kind of educational work. And had we 50 years, this would be just the thing to keep doing, because humans and human societies change best when they change gradually. It's the cheapest, least intrusive. I mean, that's how it should work. You hear this kind of message and you know, put a solar panel on your roof, and when your brother-in-law comes over at Thanksgiving, he sees it, and next spring he has a Prius in the garage, and you know, eventually we get where we need to go. Had we 50 years, that's what we would do. Our problem is we needed to start 25 years ago to have any, we're now playing catch up in a huge way. So that's a way of saying that along with education, we've also had to engage in some increasing amounts of confrontation in order to try and make this point. And I'll show you just a few images of that too. Some of you may have followed this story about the Keystone Pipeline. I'd never heard of it until 2011, when my friend Jim Hansen, the NASA climatologist, who's the best climatologist in the world, he put out a little note, sent me a little note, saying you might want to take a look at this tar sands up in Canada. There's enough oil up there that if they burned all the economically recoverable oil up there, that one deposit alone would be enough to drive the atmospheric concentration of CO2 past 500 parts per million, okay? Just from that one place. And they're building a pipeline to it right now that'll make it that much easier to keep expanding it, you know? So we decided we'd have to try and do something about it. At the time, everyone told us it was a done deal. In fact, the National Journal, the kind of trade paper for Washington, surveyed its 300 energy insiders, lobbyists, people on Capitol Hill, and 94% of them said that TransCanada would have its permit by the end of 2011. Despite the odds, we decided we'd had to try anyway. And so we staged what became the biggest civil disobedience action about anything in this country in 30 years. 1,200 and some people went to jail over the course of 2 weeks, and that was enough to sort of get things going, kicked off, you know. It spread around the world and came back to this country, and within a couple of months we ringed the White House with people 5 deep, shoulder to shoulder around that 1.5-mile perimeter of the White House. And that in 2011 was enough to convince President Obama that perhaps he should study the whole thing a little more closely. In fact, he might decide he thought to wait until after the 2012 election to make a decision, which was fine with us. And we kept at it and kept sending more emails and so on and so forth. More emails that never went to the Senate about any issue, more public testimony, more public comments on any infrastructure in the project in the country's history. And so they decided to keep waiting past the 2014 election. And again, that was good with us. Every day it kept 800,000 barrels of the dirtiest oil on earth underground. And it looks now, as if we may actually, at least for the time being, have won this fight. TransCanada has withdrawn its application for that pipeline. Now, I got to caution you that a number of candidates for president have announced that should they win, their first task in office will be to build the Keystone Pipeline. So there are no permanent victories in this field. Still, here's what's important, okay? 1, it kept all that oil in the ground. 2, it screwed up plans for investing, expanding those tar sands. They're not expanding. In fact, investors, long before the price of oil began to drop, withdrew tens of billions of dollars from new planned expansions. And 3, most important, it gave heart to a lot of other people all over the world who now are fighting every pipeline and coal port and frack well and everything with everything they've got. Because really no one had ever managed to stop a big oil industry project before. Now, well, as the head of the one of the big fossil fuel executives said in a speech at the American Natural Gas Association conference in May, he said to his fellow oil industry executives, we simply have to figure out a way to stop the Keystoneization of every project in the country. There's just too much resistance. I don't think they will stop that. I think there's going to be fights everywhere. And I think that what's happening is we're trying hard to hold them in check for a few more years, because if we do, with every day that passes, the falling price of a solar panel undercuts the economic logic of that industry. They understand that too. That's why they're pushing so hard. That's why they're going to spend $900 million on the next election. They know that they're in a battle too. They're in a battle, and they fight hard, okay? That was a billboard that went up one day a year or two ago from a group called the Heartland Institute, one of the groups that Exxon helped set up, gave a ton of money to, okay? And the billboard is a picture of Ted Kaczynski. Young people won't remember him, but he was a briefly famous career as a mass murderer sometime about 10 or 15 years ago. And the billboard said, and I have no idea why they even, where they got it from. It said, I still believe in global warming, do you? Okay? This is logically makes no sense. I mean, it's like putting up a billboard of Hitler saying, I believe in gravity, do you? But emotionally, the point of it is to make the equation between climate scientists and serial killers, okay? And it was a bad and obnoxious thing to do, and we were very happy that that very same day we happened to have set up another one of these big global days of action that we do. We called this one Connect the Dots, and it was designed to let people who were already feeling the sting of climate change kind of show themselves. So we were able to show that day what the real face of climate change looked like around the world. Since the day begins in the far Pacific, the first images were from the Marshall Islands, underwater on the coral reef, which is getting wrecked like coral reefs everywhere around the world. In this year, the hottest year, as I say, on record, the scientists estimated last week that we may lose 5% of the world's coral this year alone because those hot water temperatures are just bleaching it. Think about that. One of the most beautiful corners of God's brain just being systematically wiped out and in the course of a few years. You'd think people in Afghanistan had other things to worry about, but the Kabul River drying up is a problem. Drought, a problem everywhere. Sea level rise, a problem many places. Some places the problem's not quite so severe, you know, but skiing is a good thing. That's from the boreal forest in Siberia. We now routinely have forest fires 3, 4, 5 degrees of latitude north of where they'd ever been observed before because it's gotten so much hotter and drier. Right now, amidst the enormous drought that comes with this monster El Nino, there are forest fires in Indonesia so severe that they're producing more carbon than the entire US economy some days, okay? Not to mention making life all but impossible for people who have to live near them and breathe the smoke. People are evacuating their homes because the sea in places like Micronesia is rising into their living rooms. That top red balloon was the level of the Dead Sea 40 years ago. Literally I could go on all day. And these are people, for instance, in that part of Pakistan that in 2010 saw the worst floods since Noah. The rain came down so unprecedentedly hard that the Indus River swelled to the point where it covered 25% of the country. 20 million people were out of their homes. And if you look at them, you might guess that they probably didn't do very much to cause the problem that they now found themselves affected by. Same everywhere. I just put that in because I'm homesick, but that's, beautiful Vermont, which was ravaged by flood when we had the biggest rainstorms we've ever had by far in 2011, and there's still farm fields covered with sand and rock that won't be plowed anytime soon, but the same everywhere. That might have been the smallest demonstration of the day. Just some street in Haiti turned into a muddy river, but the sign that those kids were holding really got to me, and it said, "Your actions affect me," which is true. I mean, more people died from Hurricane Sandy in Haiti than in New York, and they still have a cholera outbreak. But what's important about it is, it doesn't work the other way around. There's nothing that they can do in Haiti to solve this problem at all. Okay? They can't burn less fossil fuel, they hardly burn any. They can't, be at the gates of the White House to get arrested and force action because no one pays any attention to what happens there. They don't have huge endowments and portfolios to divest from fossil fuel like universities around the world are now doing systematically. It's up to us to try and do anything about this. And I guess I just want to show you a few more pictures of the kind of resistance that's building all over the world. Some of you noted perhaps the amazing scenes from Portland and Seattle earlier this year when thousands of kayakers tried to block the drilling rigs that Shell was taking to start drilling in the newly melted Arctic. Think about that again just for a minute. Think about the level of moral irresponsibility that involves for Shell to have watched the Arctic melt as scientists said it would, and then instead of saying perhaps we should go into the solar panel business, to say instead, now that it's melted, it'll be easier to drill for more oil. Think about that. Happily, there were thousands of people committed enough to try and stop them, and they have stopped them. Shell's announced that, they said they didn't find enough oil to keep going back, but it's become pretty clear from sources inside the company that what they found was more trouble than they had bargained for, And there's a lot of that trouble. There were 400,000 people in the streets of New York last September, and they came from all over the country. There were buses streaming in from everywhere, Minnesota and to the east, and it was amazing. Biggest demonstration about anything in this country in many years. As a result, and they happened all over the world too, as a result, there'll be something that will come out of these Paris climate talks in a few weeks. They'll do better than the ones at Copenhagen, because at Copenhagen, which was a complete failure in 2009, Barack Obama could come back like all other world leaders, and no one gave him any trouble. Hillary Clinton presided over that complete failure, but she didn't get in any trouble over it. That's not true anymore. They would be held account now because there's enough of a movement to do it. So there will be progress there, but it won't be anywhere near enough progress to cope with the problem. We'll have to keep the pressure on all over the world, and we will keep it on. I think the last images I want to show you as I close here are ones that for some reason just move me immensely. These come from our colleagues and friends at 350 in the small Pacific Island nations, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, the Marshall Islands, places like that, about a dozen of them. These are countries that, like the Maldives, may not be here by century's end. They're just low to the water. And so people who have lived there for thousands of years will have to find someplace else to live. And with it, that culture will start to die. But they're not going easily. Their motto, as you can see, is we're not drowning, we're fighting. And fighting in this case took the form of building these indigenous canoes, one per island, and then taking them off to the world's largest coal port, which is not that far away in Australia. It's in the city of Newcastle. And there, for a day, they staged this remarkable blockade of the coal port with those canoes and kept the largest ore ships in the world in the harbor for a day. And they were remarkable images, kind of summoning us to do something likewise. Remarkably effective, not in blocking the ships forever, but a few weeks later, we were able to declare that plans for the biggest coal mine in the planet, not far from there in Western Australia, were now dead because no bank would finance it. We've been able to round up every bank in the world and keep them from doing it. And a few weeks after that, the city council of Newcastle, again the largest coal port in the world, voted to divest its stock holdings, its pension funds and things, from fossil fuel. Think about that. Think about how moved people were and how able to glimpse what the world should be like they were. Were I a good organizer, I would just stop there and leave you inspired and hopeful and ready to go, because there's lots of things to work on. There's lots of things even here in Indiana where you've got, just in the next week, you've got senators who'll be voting on important pieces of legislation and so on and so forth. And I hope you'll work on all that. But I got to tell you the truth, which is there is no guarantee that we're going to win this fight. No guarantee. Dr. King always used to say at the end of talks, quoting, I think, from the abolitionist Theodore Parker, he'd always say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Roughly translated, this may take a while, but we're going to win. Okay? That's not necessarily the case with this crisis. The arc of the physical universe is short and it bends toward heat. And if we do not win it soon, then we won't win it. And there are scientists who think we may have waited too long to get started. Clearly, we're not going to stop global warming at this point. Too late for that. The best science indicates we have a window, maybe, to keep it from getting entirely out of control, but that is a narrow window and it is closing fast, and it will require of us not just that we change our light bulbs, not just that we buy a more fuel-efficient car. Mainly, it will require of us that we become citizens again in the sense that we join together to demand change. This is a structural and systemic problem. It is sustained by the richest companies on earth and by individual men who are willing to spend $900 million on election campaigns. You all are a very prosperous-looking bunch, but my guess is even if we pooled our resources, we'd still be somewhat short of $900 million. And that means that we are going to need to figure out how to pool the other resources we have, which are passion and spirit and creativity and you know, maybe once in a great while the willingness to go off to jail too, because that tends to have been what movements have taken over the years. I cannot guarantee that we're going to win, but I've done my best with those pictures just to show you what I can guarantee, which is that there is, darn it, going to be a real fight about this question. Finally, human beings have woken up to the point where they are going to fight tooth and nail to keep this planet in some kind of shape that would be familiar to our forebears. It's always a great honor to be in the rooms where people are planning that fight, and there are in thousands of rooms like that around this world tonight. And it's an honor to be in this room with you, because I know that many of you are engaged in this work. And I will just say I look forward to standing shoulder to shoulder with you on it in the years to come. Thank you all very much. And I think that I've left enough time, yes, that we can have a few questions, and I think that there are microphones hither and yon, perhaps, that you could line up behind. Do not hesitate to, I let you have it full force, so questions, comments, abuse, anything is fair game. So have at it. I can't see well enough to know where people are, but so someone start.
My education is engineering and science, and I have no doubts about what's going on. I think we have a real problem that has become totally unmanageable. What concerns me is my grandchildren's future, and it's concerned is that we keep seeming to kick the can down the road. I read extensively about this and other things, but I see no definitive plans how to deal with any segment, because our cultures are fragmented, our politicians are fragmented, not only in the US, but other countries around the world. There's 100 million cars on the road, 18-wheelers uncountable, all spewing, but there's no definitive plan or timeline to say, here's how we're going to get rid of those.
So the problem is less that we don't know what to do. We have a pretty good idea what the big obvious steps are. For 25 years, as I said, every economist, left, right, center, has said job one is put a serious price on carbon. It's crazy that this is the only thing you get to throw out for free. If you think of a restaurant on the main drag in Fort Wayne, the cheapest way for it to get rid of its trash at the end of the day would just be to shovel it out in the middle of the street, and its profits would go up. But, a week or two later, you'd have rat trouble in Fort Wayne, and you'd be leptospirosis, and, the definition of civilization is that we pick up after ourselves unless we're a fossil fuel company, in which case we get to pour carbon into the atmosphere absolutely for free. That's why they're the richest industry. So if you put a price on carbon, you would speed this transition. At this point, that's probably not enough because we've waited so long. We also need huge support. Look at what our country did faced with World War II, with the need to fight fascism in Europe. We re-geared in the course of a couple of years our industrial capacity for 4 or 5 years to concentrate on producing what we needed in order to win that fight. We need to do something on that scale again, and we need to do it around the world. There are places where it's demonstrated that it can be done. Germany and Scandinavia both have done remarkable things, and now others, a few places, are starting to follow their lead. But it will not happen on the scale that we need it to happen as long as the fossil fuel industry remains powerful enough to control our destinies. There's a story in the newspapers today about the fact that days before crucial votes on things like lifting the oil export ban, which will lead to lots more drilling than this, executives of fossil fuel companies, including the CEO of Exxon, gave 5-figure gifts, cash campaign contributions to the crucial committee chairman in Congress, and the votes went their way. That's just, we can't let that happen anymore. It's going to happen, so we have to be able to counter it with something, some force of our own. And that's why we try to build these movements. If we get the political will correct, I worry less about the solutions. I think that they're mostly there. We're just not putting them in place. But it's exactly the right question. Thank you.
Hello, I'm David Schuster, and I teach history here at IPFW. And first of all, thank you very much for coming and speaking with us tonight. There's something about environmentalism in America that traditionally has been bipartisan, right? Teddy Roosevelt established the National Forest Service. He was a Republican, a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, the Park Service. And during Richard Nixon's term, you have some of the most sweeping environmental regulations that have gone in, the EPA, Endangered Species Act. But something happened between Nixon and Reagan. So when Reagan came into office, one of the first things he did is he removed solar panels from the White House. And he told media who asked why, he said, because that was a statement of defeat. I'm curious, I realize money is important now, but I don't think money was so important in 1980, 81. It seems almost like there's an ideological divide now that's split between the political parties. And I'm curious, as someone who's thought about this more than I have, where do you see the origin of this?
Oh, you're a better historian than I am. I have enough trouble with the problems of the day, as it says in the good book, let the day's worries be sufficient unto themselves. Who knows exactly where that was rooted? My guess is it was more rooted in money than one might imagine, and the so-called sagebrush rebellion of the Reagan years is a lot about extractive industry. But there were also, and I should say, since I'm a good, well, at least a reasonable Methodist Sunday school teacher, I should say that some of the blame was on us Christians as well. We were willing to entertain for a while this sort of notion that we were, allowed to do anything we wanted with the planet. And there were people who got up and said that and over again. Happily, that's, I think, changing very fast as people are starting to realize that, any reasonable reading of Scripture would indicate that we're supposed to take care of this nice place that we've been given, But I don't know exactly where the roots of it all lie. I'm glad that there are people hard at work on figuring it out because it might give us insights. But my sense is that the battle is so desperate right at the moment that that's probably where the focus is going to have to remain. But it's a very interesting question, and thank you for it.
Thank you.
I'm Doug Hansen, a retired teacher. I'm visiting from Oregon, where this year the state legislature has passed legislation basically leaving the burning of wood unregulated. This kind of follows along the lines of the Kyoto Accords, which placed wood in the category of renewables as opposed to fossil fuels. Could you weigh in on what you're aware of, maybe in the works for addressing this concern about the increasing use of wood as a replacement for coal in power plant electrical generation?
Right. So this is a good question. First thing to be said is, if there are people here like me who burn wood to keep their homes warm, don't worry about it. It's not a great sin. We did, however, used to think that burning wood was pretty much entirely benign. And the reason, if you think about it, is because though it produces carbon, the tree that grows in the place of the one you cut down should suck up an equivalent amount of carbon over the course of its life. So it's better in that sense than burning coal. However, we've had a serious rethinking of this math over the years for two reasons. One, burning wood is really inefficient, especially for things like electricity, so you get a lot of carbon. And two, that carbon is coming just at the wrong time. That is to say, if we put a big pulse of carbon into the atmosphere from burning wood over the next 20 or 30 years, it won't make any difference if it gets sucked up 60 or 70 years hence, because we already will have done the damage that we were going to do. We will have crossed the kind of carbon tipping points. So the plans for industrial burning of wood are bad, and we're working hard to try and stop them, at least out where I live in the Northeast. In general, just as a kind of general rule, our big job here is to get away from burning things as best we can, okay? And to replace combustion with these other ways of providing power, which still seem to us like a little strange, that we would rely on the sun or the wind. But when you think about the sheer amount of power that washes across the continent each day, at least for a frugal type like me, there's something just horrible about watching it all go to waste, all uncaptured. So I think that's very much the direction we're headed in. And as we head there, I think we're heading from centralized power generation, big things that burn stuff, towards what the engineers call distributed generation, towards an energy system that works the way the internet works, where everybody puts some in and takes some out, where we have 1 million solar panels on 1 million rooftops, not a few giant power stations. That's my guess where we're going.
Thank you for taking my question. This might be a distasteful question, but I have to ask it because I'm a recent graduate of IU in Bloomington. I studied environmental management. So I'm not that old. My whole life I've seen, attempts at fixing climate change, global warming, whatever you want to call it. And it just seems to me that nothing has happened. I've read about eco-terrorism groups, ELF, and others. I was just wondering what your opinion is on those groups, and if you think they do a service or a disservice to the climate change movement.
I think they're a bad idea in all kinds of ways, and some of those are just my own kind of moral predispositions against, kind of violence and destruction and things. But partly it's also because, just in practical terms, it strikes me that they're exactly what, if I were an oil company, I'd want to see some of going on, that they discredit everything, turn people to all the kind of fear and loathing that burning things down or tossing rocks through windows or whatever it is automatically produces. It's a really, if you're, how to say this? If your adversary has enormous amounts of a certain kind of power, then that's the wrong weapon to choose to go after them with. You got to find one that you have and they don't. That's one of the reasons that nonviolence is such an interesting thing. My guess is that when people look back on the 20th century, they'll think of Gandhian nonviolence as one of the most interesting inventions of that century. One whose power we still don't fully understand, but are beginning to tap. And I'll tell you a funny little story that may make you think I'm a kook. But a few weeks ago, I was telling this at dinner. A few weeks ago, when these stories about Exxon were first emerging, the fact that Exxon knew about climate change and had covered it up, I was very worried that they would disappear, these stories, because everything disappears. You know, every day there's 10,000 news stories, and, you know, Justin Bieber does something, and, you know, whatever. It's all, there you are. So in order to play my small part in keeping them from disappearing, along with writing a bunch of pieces myself in the New Yorker and places, I also went and did a little bit of kind of Thoreauvian civil disobedience. I just went up to the Exxon station near where I did and sat down in front of the pump and closed it down for a couple of hours until I was arrested and taken away. And, you know, I don't know completely how effective it was. It was a little effective. I got a call, I was saying, from that night from a friend of mine who's an executive at Facebook who said, "Hey, you were the top trending thing on Facebook all afternoon, until you were replaced by a video of a corgi barking at a miniature pumpkin." But but it was a little useful, and it was a hell of a lot more useful than it would have been to, like, go, you know, take my car and knock over the pump or something, at which point everyone would just have been alarmed and disgusted and whatever. So I think that all the kind of interesting tools of peaceful resistance are of extreme interest to me. I think they're very, very powerful, much more so than than that sort of thing. Very good question. Thank you. Do we have time for a couple more here? I don't want to abuse people's patience, but if we do 2 or 3 more here, would be great.
Hi, I'm Andrew Jokerst. First, I want to thank you for coming, talking about, you know, one of the most pressing issues of our time. So from what I've gathered, there's little doubt that one of the leading causes of climate change in the world is animal agriculture. A report from 2006 from the United Nations, FAO states that animal agriculture is responsible for 18% of human-caused greenhouse gases. That's compared to about 13% from all transportation.
Right.
And a more recent report from the World Watch Institute says that that figure could be as high as 51%. So given this information and given that, you know, this is something that everyone could contribute to by, you know, moving towards a vegan lifestyle, why is this not a major focus of the mainstream environmental movement?
Well, I think there are plenty of people working on it, happily. I'll tell you why it's not the main focus of my work. You're right, about 18% we think of emissions derived from this. The problem is always, given that we have a very short time in which to work, figuring out what kind of change we can get. So, one possibility is to campaign hard for veganism all over the world, okay? My guess is, and I haven't done it, so I don't know, but my guess is that in the sort of relevant time frame, we'd get 4 or 5, 6% of people to go along. Maybe not that high, because as I travel in the emerging, developing world, there are a huge number of people who are just coming into eating meat, and for them it's a remarkable pleasure, and very hard for them to understand why people wouldn't engage in it if they could. But maybe we'd get 4, 5, 6, 7%, which would not be useless, okay, but it wouldn't be enough to cause a real shift in the physics of the atmosphere. My guess always is that on issues like this, we can get 4 or 5% of people really engaged. If we're able to take that and shift it, focus it on system change, not individual change, then perhaps we can leverage that 4 or 5% into change that's big enough to matter. That is to say, if we can get 4 or 5% of people really engaged in building a movement around climate change and working on, say, a price on carbon, one of the first things that would change with the serious price on carbon would be some of our worst agricultural practices, because they depend on an immense amount of very cheap fossil energy to keep them happening. So I guess from my point of view, that's the strategic calculation for me. But if you can figure out a way, I mean, and it, you know, it's not, I mean, I told you the story of how we launched 350 with, you know, one rider and 7 college students, and we were taking an almost completely unfamiliar concept, how many parts per million carbon there were in the atmosphere. You know, I have no doubt that you'll be able to figure out with 7 of your friends how to launch something great around veganism, and if you do, well, I'll do what I can to lend my hand. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Hello. My question has to do a bit with what you were saying about how we have a limited window of time to deal with this, and how even though you put a lot of effort into writing books and articles, and that just probably isn't enough. And I'm very passionate about this. You know, I look at all these issues and everything that's happening, and it makes my blood boil, and I just want to get involved in every way I can, but I encounter a lot of cynicism. I try to bring up the subject with anyone and everyone, but it's kind of disheartening when I try to talk to the layman instead of just, you know, my fellow college-educated people, and there's just so much disinformation, and a lot of people don't want to hear it. A lot of people think that it's all just some hoax, like people have been manipulated by Exxon in them, and I wanted to maybe get some advice on how to approach that.
Sure. So the first thing to be said is, and I was kind of following on what I said before, you don't actually need to convince everybody, okay? So if you have some uncle who has spent the last 30 years like marinating in Rush Limbaugh, you know, do not, you know, spoil Thanksgiving dinner by forcing him, you know, because it's not going to work. The point is, there are a certain number of people whose position on this has nothing to do with science, or it's just ideological, okay? And there's no real way to, but there are not that many of them. The polling data gets better with each passing month because Mother Nature keeps doing her best to, you know, hit us with an increasingly larger stick. The polling data, the last I saw was very recent. It was interesting, and it said that about 3/4 of Americans now understand the fix that we're in and want to do something about it. And what was most interesting, because people always say, oh, but Republicans don't, you know, they don't get it or whatever. 59% of Republicans were in the same boat. Don't bother trying to convert the last most difficult person out there. Find the people who agree with you and band together to make change of some kind. So, you know, on, say, college campuses all over the country, students have done a really good job of pushing for the divestment of fossil fuel stocks from their endowments. I mean, right now, as we speak, a huge bunch of kids at MIT are staging a big sit-in. They've been there for 2.5 weeks. These are some of the brightest kids in the country, you know, our future scientific leaders, demanding that kind of thing. and they're finding lots and lots of support within the community. Earlier today, 93 faculty members signed a big letter of support, and some of them have showed up to help. So on college campuses or in wherever you are, in your church community, whatever it is, you can do all kinds of useful organizing around these things. You won't always win, but that's all right. Every time you bring it up, you're kind of raising awareness, and that's an important part of this, you know. So I commend you, but I think don't worry yourself with the thought that you're responsible for convincing every last soul. You know, even the best missionaries only get a certain fairly small percentage of their target audience to the altar. So don't worry yourself over much. Just find the people who you can work with and work with them, and that'll be good.
Thank you.
One more over here.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I know that the tar sands oil processing is a much more costly form of excavating oil. And you mentioned how the Republican presidential candidates are still throwing their support behind Keystone. And I was wondering how much of that financial viability had to do with the withdrawal of TransCanada, and if it did play a huge role, what would be like our next step as far as opposition?
Right, so the tar sands are a continuing huge problem because there's so much oil up there. For the moment, the expansion has largely stopped. It continues. There are plenty of people who want to keep trying to get at it, but and you know, the Koch brothers are the single largest leaseholders in the they own more of Alberta than anybody else, and that's why they want to spend $900 million in the next election. But there's lots and lots of people standing up to them. As we speak today, there's people sitting in outside the house of the new Canadian Prime Minister right around this issue, demanding a moratorium on expansion in the tar sands. First Nations people, Indigenous people, Native Americans, both sides of the border have been great leaders in this fight, and so have, interestingly, farmers and ranchers, because the pipeline was going to go through their land. Last year in Washington, we helped convene a gathering of Native Americans and ranchers, came and put teepees on the mall in Washington for a week and rode horses back and forth, and they were very effective, and they had a good time, and they called themselves the Cowboy Indian Alliance, the CIA. And it was a very good reminder of what creative organizing can do around these things. I'm still somewhat disbelieving that even for the moment we've managed to stop this thing, because everybody told us that we couldn't possibly stop it. But I'm glad that we did, and it was well worth, I spent 3 days in Central Cell Block in DC, which is as much fun as it sounds like, but it wasn't the end of the world. The end of the world is the end of the world, and that's why we do this stuff that we're doing. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.